welcome, Ingrid. Thanks for coming to talk to us all. I wonder if we could start by you defining your term libertarianism and tell us whether you invented this term or whether it's something you've discovered.
Yes, so first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here with you to discuss the ideas in the book. Libertarianism is indeed a term I coined, but the ideas, they have predecessors throughout the history of economic and political thought. I can name many thinkers who've proposed something similar, but just to mention one, Plato from the ancient Greeks said that the difference between the lowest and the highest property owners in society should be 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. Now, since many people actually don't hold any wealth, that is pretty problematic if we were to apply that to current days society. So the ideas have there are traces throughout history. How I define it in the book is that just like we say that nobody should be poor, nobody should be below a certain line of income and wealth, I also think that nobody should be above a certain line. And there are many reasons for that. And the first one, which actually we just had in the exercise, is that at some point it covers what you need. It covers highest quality of life and so on. But as I found out when writing this book, there are also all sorts of harms that wealth concentration can cause, but then it tends to be at higher levels of higher amounts.
Okay, thanks. And tell us a bit about your background and your motivation for writing this book. What prompted you personally to dive into this subject?
Yes, so I am by training an economist and a philosopher. I studied actually more years economics than philosophy, but I always felt that the ethical questions were lacking in the discipline, and that's why I then went on to do philosophy. And I've always worked on questions of inequality. But if we look at what philosophers do, but also I think many politicians and thinkers, they talk about inequality in general terms, and then if they talk about issues or problems, they focus on the poor. Yes, inequality, and then they reduce it to an issue of poverty. And one day I just wondered, like, why don't we never talk about whether there's actually also a problem at the other side of the distribution? And I dropped this idea to my colleagues who thought this was funny, or they were making jokes like, so what do you want to do, shoot the rich? So they didn't think this was a serious academic question. But in the meantime, there is there are more and more people who do research on this.
You mentioned in the book, in the preface, I think, a story about your son that prompted you to think about this point. Was it he saw someone homeless? Or?
Yeah, that's in one of the chapters, yes. Yeah, I think that's really more... So in the book, there's this story that I cycle with my son, and he sees a homeless person, and he's really kind of shocked, and he literally says, I'm ashamed that we as society let people live like this. And I think, the reason why this stuck with me is because that conveys a certain attitude towards responsibilities we have towards others in society, whereas I think the prevailing culture, or if you want to use that word, ideology, is much more, it's their responsibility. So we keep the poor responsible for their poverty, but we also do the opposite at the other side. We say, oh, if somebody is economically very successful, it's also they can claim it to be to their credit. And I think that frame, that idea of human nature that is behind this is actually I think quite problematic.
Yeah, I think we heard in the UK recently that homelessness is a lifestyle choice. I don't know if you heard that.
Seriously?
Yeah. And but you're right. The effects of poverty are much more visible. And I think you were making the point that you don't see wealth is invisible. It's not seen in your daily life, right? When we walk around our towns.
Yeah, in any case, not to the extent that, I mean, the very poor people, they can't hide it that they're poor. I mean, like the homeless people, but also children that live in poverty, they always come with the same clothes to school. They sometimes don't have food, so they don't have lunch that they bring to school. So they can't go to children's parties because they don't have a present to bring to the party. So they can't hide it. Whereas I think in the case of if you're wealthy, you can choose either to show it or not.
Yes, okay. And you mentioned it just now, but you said there are certain corrupting effects of concentrations of wealth. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yes, so I describe them in the book as what I see as harms to society. And each of those, I devote an entire chapter, so what I'm going to say now will be very brief and condensed. But one is that it really has, it poses a risk for democracies. So we all tend to subscribe to the democratic principle, one person, one vote. But we see that wealth holders, and that can be either the persons or often companies that very wealthy people own, they spend a lot of money on lobbying, and lobbying then steers the direction of our political decision-making away from what the voters would or the public would want. They can also spend money on political candidates, and here the context matters because we just see, for example, in the US, this is a really, really big problem. What I understand from the UK is that it's also an issue. In Europe, we have actually, stronger, I mean continental Europe. We have stronger walls between the sphere of politics and the sphere of the economy. But still, the super rich or the very rich always try to find ways around it. And then there is, they can buy media, they can buy think tanks. And we've seen, for example, from the historical research that think tanks were very important in spreading the current culture that we have, so what is called neoliberalism.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the phrase $1, one vote quite often, not one person, one vote.
Yeah.
But as part of my membership of Patriotic Millionaires, I think Bex is here somewhere, I can't see in the gloom, but there. We had a poll recently that went out in the press, and we interviewed 2,300 people of wealth, everyone at least $1 million in wealth, several billionaires in the group. And 72% of that group from the G20 countries agreed that high wealth has high political influence and can affect democracy. So we had, categorical proof that people believe that.
Yeah, there are political scientists who study this. They do case studies or they study it with large data sets. And for example, in the case of the US, I mean, they just say the US is no longer a democracy, it's an oligarchy.
Yes, indeed. And you also have a chapter on climate impact, right?
Yes, so there, what I argue is, so that's another harm of wealth concentration, is that concentrated wealth doesn't go together with ecological sustainability. In theory, it does. And actually, I know one former entrepreneur who has spent all his money on reclaiming land that was farmland that became very bad land, and he rewilded it. So that's a possibility, that you put all your money into what's something that's ecologically improving. But what we see from the large data is that only the lifestyles of the very rich have carbon footprints that are multiple times what is ecologically sustainable. So for most of Europe, the average carbon footprint is around 9 to 10 ton CO2 or CO2 equivalent per person per year. What the scientists say may be kind of sustainable is around 2, perhaps 3. In Africa, except South Africa and the oil countries, it is 1. But then if you look at the 1%, it is on average 101 tons. But if you look at the billionaires, it goes up to 8,000 tons. And then we haven't considered the climate effects of their investments. So if they invest in some of the most profitable industries like the fossil industry, it just multiplies how the effect is on climate change.
Okay. So your book gets very quickly into what you believe are the thresholds that we should adopt. Do you want to tell us about those and why you picked those particular numbers?
Yes. So I argue for 2 thresholds. One is a political threshold where I think that if we want to reduce inequality in society in the way we set up the system, the economic system, the fiscal system, we should try to aim at what I propose for a context similar to my own country, 10 million pounds or euros. So I say pounds, euros, dollars, because I don't think it matters. We are arguing about the ballpark figure. The reason why I say 10 million, I mean, maybe that in half a year from now I will conclude because of discussions with others that is too low. It's possible, but I want to make very clear, I don't believe it should be 1 billion. And you have, especially in the US, but also in Europe, a lot of people who say, yes, we should get, I mean, they then say we should get rid of billionaires. I think in any case, we shouldn't get rid of any people, but you could say we should get rid of billions, yes, but a billion is 1,000 million. Just translate that into, say, how many flats you can buy with 1 billion in London, and you just get a sense of the amount. So I use the 10 million to just give a sense of where I think the conversation, where I want to kick off the conversation. But then that amount, that political threshold, is in order to try to reduce the harms to society, so the undermining of politics, the climate effects, but actually I believe that for many of us, and we've actually seen this with the people who went to sit before the 10 million was named as a number, I think many of us would be leading perfectly happy lives with much less. So there is this second threshold, which I call the ethical, which is voluntaristic, and that's just one that each of us should just ask in our own personal context, how much is enough for me? And therefore, the context matters, because I say this figure of 1 million comes also from research we've done in the Netherlands, but I should say the Netherlands has a universal pension system, so everybody, no matter what you did in your life, you get a pension that's roughly at the poverty line. So that means also the number of poor among the elderly in the Netherlands is very low. Actually, I should say, shamefully, we have a lot of poor children, but we have very few poor elderly, and that's just because we have a universal pension system. And the other thing that we have is we have a healthcare system that is a kind of a mixed economy element. It's provided by private entrepreneurs, but they're very deeply regulated, and it's universal. So that means two of the very important reasons why people sometimes want to save a lot are taken care of. And so that means that you might say, well, in the UK, especially if you fear that the NHS will collapse, that figure might be different.
Yeah, and I think there are other country differences as well, like 10 million, as you've said, 10 million euros in the Netherlands is probably a very healthy amount of money. In rural UK, it is as well. Maybe in London, starting to get a little bit less comfortable.
Yeah.
And in the US, probably not at all in terms of healthcare and education costs.
Yeah.
Had you thought about making it a percentage of the like basically correlated to the top wealth earners as a percentage rather than a hard number?
Yeah, so that's a possibility. I just think, for example, the US is also incredibly rich. So if you were to make it relative to whatever element of the distribution, it would mean that the richer a country is, and the more unequal countries tend to be more rich on average, the higher the richest line would be. And that to me sounds counterintuitive, because especially perhaps both lines, but definitely the lower one, should really be the answer to the question, how much do I need, given my circumstance, for example, given whether I have somebody with special needs I need to take care for, or whether I need to save for my pension, how much do I need to lead a good life? And it would be weird to me that if you live in a country that is very, very rich, that number would be higher.
Yeah, and I think you're trying to find a number that everybody can kind of agree on is a broad level above which you're pretty financially healthy, right? But
also I think, for me it's up to debate. I'm really happy. I had, for example, a Belgian I was going to say a retired entrepreneur, but actually he's my age, just 50, but he basically sold his firm and said, okay, I now have 3.5 million euros. I decided this is enough. And he said, but it doesn't really matter 3.5 or 1. That's not the point of debate, and I agreed. So he wanted to discuss some other issues with me. Yeah. I don't think the numbers are very important. I really try to stress in the book the reasons. So I would like to have a political debate about what are the reasons why we should consider that there should be a cap to how much we can have in terms of wealth.
Yeah, I was in this very building actually for an event. I was a guest of an event at the philanthropy workshop last year. And there were many people of wealth there who are philanthropists. And there was a discussion at lunch about what is enough. And I think I mentioned a number of 5 million maybe. And just for the record, actually, for the podcast, most people in this room sat down when we got somewhere between the 5 million and 10 million number. I think everybody sat down by the time we got to 50. But yeah, there was this feeling I had of like 5. And then some of the Americans were saying, oh, no, it's 10 minimum. And then one lady said, it's 100 for me. And it turned out her family were Holocaust survivors. And she had in the back of her mind that something terrible can go wrong with civilization, and she needs an extra insurance policy. Yeah. So individual perceptions of what is enough wealth obviously vary considerably. Yeah. You have a quote in your book. You're actually asking a question. Why were the gains from globalization distributed so unequally, and who got to decide? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in the book I give some statistics about wealth inequality, the distribution, and I start with the global distribution. And there is this tendency among economists, which I still consider also one of the tribes I belong to be very optimistic about what happened in the last decades, to say, oh, but the globalization has lifted many poor out of poverty globally. And under one definition, this is true. That is the international extreme poverty line, which is around $2 a day. But you should know it's not $2 a day what you can do with $2 in, say, Antananarivo, the capital for Madagascar. It is what you can do with $2 in the US. So it's purchasing power parity, the term that economists use. So it's extremely low. You can survive on $2. And with that number, it's true that the number of poor has decreased. And it's also true that some countries like China has really had a really big economic development. And in India, you've seen a middle class. So this is all true. But to me, that's not the only important question. The important question is, what is a real poverty line? And there, development economists, but also NGOs such as Oxfam say, you should talk about between $11 and $12, and then the numbers go up massively. But also the question is, if we look at the total wealth that has been created by economic globalization, how have we divided this between the global north, and then especially the richest in the global north, and the people who live in poverty? And the figures just suggest or show that we've given breadcrumbs, really tiny bits to the poorest, and it's the richest in the global north who've taken the lion's share.
I saw a quote this week. Forgive me, I can't remember if it's in your book or somewhere else, but the 5 richest men in the world have doubled their billionaire fortune since 2020, and meanwhile 5 billion people have become poorer since 2020. Was that you? No,
not me, but that is also, of course, because of the pandemic.
Yes.
So the pandemic really has intensified
concentrated wealth.
The mechanisms. So, but I think the real question I think we should ask is, of all feasible scenarios, which one do we want? Okay. And often we are asked, like people ask, yeah, but the entrepreneurs have lifted, the multinationals have lifted some of these people out of poverty. Yes, that's true, but what would have been other scenarios that would also have been possible? Because they have like hundreds of billions. Why?
Okay, I'm going to ask you for a couple of definitions because they're important when I get to the tough questions.
Okay.
Could you define for us capitalism and neoliberalism and what they mean to you?
Yes, so I actually do say about capitalism that I actually asked that question also in the book. But neoliberalism, so capitalism is the system we currently have with, actually we still have somewhat mixed economies, but it's where you have private ownership of the means of production. So that means the companies are in hands of individuals or or shareholders, in any case, persons, not the governments, and also not predominantly common ownership, because that's another possibility that you leave the government out, but you have, for example, housing cooperatives. Cooperatives is a good example of a third model. So but that is one way to look at capitalism, but there are other people who define capitalism as a system whereby those who have capital/wealth will constantly seek to accumulate wealth. And that's not the definition I learned when I studied economics, but what I've been finding in all the research I did, and not the research that I did, but the research I read by mainly people who do empirical work, is that tendency of those who have money to want to accumulate further, all the research supports this. And I think that is really what is a defining element of capitalism. And then the neoliberalism is the current form of capitalism that we have since, well, the placeholders are Thatcher and Reagan, whereby the kind of more mixed economy that we had after the war, the 30 years after the war, with the New Deal in America and the welfare states in all of Europe, the welfare states have been scaled down. And we've come to privatize a lot of government-owned companies. And also, I think at the level of culture and ideology, we've come to see human beings and ourselves differently, in economic terms. So, we don't see ourselves so much anymore as a citizen, but much more as a consumer, a worker, and students are no longer somebody who develop their whole person, but they are investors in their human capital.
I get the sense later in the book that you are quite neutral about capitalism, but you really don't like neoliberalism. What are the things that you find most objectionable about neoliberalism?
Yes, so the problem with neoliberalism is that it has created the dangerous, which I really think is a dangerous situation we're in now, with the very, I think in some degree of inequality is, I think, can be justified, and some degree is inevitable because of the way societies work. But right now, the inequalities we have really been politically facilitated. And that is because of these neoliberal choices that have been made. Okay. So that's one problem. And I also think we've privatized a lot of goods that we should not have put on the market. So, for example, nowadays we have things like healthcare and childcare in private equity. These things do not go together. I mean, I can give a whole explanation of why this is the case, but so I think the profit-seeking motive plays a role. Markets play a very important role, but they should be in their space. Okay. And so when you say I am trying to stay neutral on capitalism, I think I try to indeed. I don't bite a bullet in the last chapter on which economic system I think we should have, because I should say I also don't know yet, because there are all these alternatives, but I do say not the one we currently have. And so the question is, do you describe the mixed economy that we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? If that qualifies as capitalism, then yes, I do not necessarily reject capitalism. Okay, we'll come back to that theme. There were a number of, I'm on your side generally, right? I believe that inequality needs to be reduced and taxes need to go up and social contract needs to be strengthened. But there were some statements and concepts in your book that really made me gasp when I read them the first time. Let's start with an easy one. Nobody deserves to be a multimillionaire. That's one of your assertions. Do you want to tell us about that, and also about the idea, what if there was an ethical entrepreneur
who created something the world really needed and wanted, and why shouldn't they become a billionaire during their lifetime because of that product or service?
Yes. So I'm not surprised that made you gasp, because I really think that this idea of that we deserve what we can reap on the market, that is really one of those ideas that neoliberalism has planted in our heads. And when I studied economics, so that was in the 1990s, my training had these assumptions. And that means that I think there almost entire generations have been raised with this as kind of almost fact. And it's deeply normative and it's deeply political. So that is just to kind of as a warm-up to what I'm going to say about the argument. So what I write in the book about desert is not so radical among philosophers. Actually, many philosophers, there are philosophers who are more radical than what I do. The idea is that so much of what we can accomplish in our lives is a matter of luck. That's not how we tend to look at ourselves, because, as I mentioned earlier, the neoliberal culture has tried to keep us responsible for both our failures and our success. But if you try to think about two things, the natural lottery and the social lottery. So natural lottery is the talents you were born with, the health you were born with, possible impairments or disabilities, but also something like energy levels. So I think I've lived long enough to just see that people have very different energy levels. For example, I'm really lucky that I have very high energy levels, but I really think this is luck. I don't tell myself, now you should have high energy levels. No. So you should, if this means that you can accomplish something, you should not, of course you can feel proud because you can't kind of become a full determinist looking at yourself as a robot, but you should more like kind of count your blessings rather than say, oh, look, I did this and now I deserve whatever this means in the market. So that's the natural lottery. And then the social lottery, the parents we were born with, the place we were born in, the class we were born in, the material circumstances we were born in, none of this we choose. Child development psychologists say that the first 1,000 days in a person's life are the most important. How can we be held responsible for anything that happens in the first 1,000 days? We can't. So that means that so much of our opportunities are a matter of luck. And then there's also another element of luck, which is that, and this is difficult to, this is tricky, but there's actually a lot of luck in the market too. So there is research that shows that, for example, when they pick a CEO, although all CEOs, well, let's assume, but I think this is often true, the CEOs are all the candidates are very talented, accomplished people, then to decide which one gets the job, it's a small factor, but that factor is pivotal. That factor makes a difference, and that's luck.
Okay.
So luck is just pervasive.
Okay. So the next one is interesting because your lovely publicist, Penn, sent me a summary of the book at the beginning before I read the whole book. And the summary has a very provocative statement, which is, individual wealth above this 10 million limit should be confiscated by governments because it is neither economically necessary nor morally justifiable. But in the book, I can't find that quote.
Can I just blame Penn?
You have two references to it, one raised as a question and one raised as a joke. So where do you stand on that point?
Yeah. So it's more that I think we should try to organize society to limit inequality from the top down. And of course, I know we're never going to get to 10 million. I know. But I think that also because the book documents and other research also documents that there's so much corruption and dirty money and all that kind of stuff going on in the economy. So I know we will never get there. But I think the pure philosophical case supports this. And then the thing is that should that money go to the government? That depends on how good our governments are. So the case I discuss about inheritance tax. So inheritance tax is also a very tricky thing because the sentiment in the population is it's the most hated tax And that is because we all want to leave something to our children, which is logical because we love them. So we want to do something when we are dead.
It's an incredibly unpopular tax here in
Yeah.
the UK, and only 4% of estates end up paying it. So most of the people who worry about it and would vote for a government that would ban it are never going to be subject to inheritance tax.
So it's pretty irrational. The views of most people are emotionally totally understandable, but I think they are, if you look at the numbers, they are irrational. But I understand that you don't want to give the money to the government, and because many people have all sorts of issues with the government, but if you were to have a system whereby there would be a much higher inheritance tax, and I would then ideally plea for a cap on inheritance, and it goes completely 100% back to the population, not to the government, and it gives everybody a stake when they're young, it would first of all massively increase equal opportunity, which we now don't have, and also redistribute between generations, because now really it's the older people who hold a lot of the economic power, and then also hold, actually, they also influence politics disproportionately. And the younger people, I mean, we see the problems with, for example, young people in their 20s trying to buy a home. Yes. It's almost impossible. So if you were to not just, and the problem with inheritance is not inheritance per se, the problem is that it's so unequal. That is a problem.
Yes. You also say at one point, having more than £1 million, dollars or euros does not meaningfully enhance your quality of life. As a London resident, I can say that doesn't feel true to me.
Yeah, so that's what we found from the research we did in the Netherlands. And I also say in the book, but perhaps I have not repeated enough, in the Dutch context. And that was a study we did in 2018. So I guess you can add like 10, 12% inflation, but still the research we did where we described to a representative sample of the Dutch population, we described lifestyles. We didn't give numbers because numbers, I mean, numbers are difficult to grasp, but we described lifestyles and then asked people, where would you say that somebody is well off, very well off, and then at some point, now somebody has so much money, any additional money can't improve the quality of life of that person. 96.5% of the respondents did put a limit somewhere. But of course, they disagreed where they put the limits.
Okay.
Yeah, and the geometric mean was 1 million per person.
Fair enough. And this was the one that got the biggest gasp from me. Almost all fortunes are based in part or whole on dirty money.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. And that is because, for example, if we were to pay, so even if you have a profession that is completely like outside anything that can have anything to do with tainted money, if somebody who is like in this position were to pay the proper fair price for, say, clothing, we would have less savings. So and so that means that, but the problem with this, I think what I wrote is true. The problem is that you really need to kind of look at all the sources of our economic interactions. So I think if we do not pay the fair price for the products that are made in developing countries, and also we do not pay the what economists call the negative externalities of our goods that we buy that have climate damage, which means we basically shift the cost to the future, to future people and people who will live in the future. It means that if we were to pay that true price, both to the global south and to the future, we would have less.
Yeah, okay.
That is the dirtiness. And then, of course, for the big fortunes, it's different. It's corruption and all these things that have been documented.
Corruption, crime, evasion, exploitation. I think when capitalism works in its purest form, it's a voting machine, right? People buy products and services with their money, and capitalism is trickle-up economics, right? So a part of what they pay goes to pay for the product and service, and a part is a margin that kind of flows back up to the people who create that product or service. And I feel like that's how my business worked. But
Yeah.
I think there are arguments that pure forms of capitalism can generate wealth without it being dirty.
The problem with the market is that you have all the, what economists call negative externalities are not integrated in the price. Negative externalities are costs that basically you have a transaction between two people and there is a cost shifted onto somebody else. And that can be, for example, climate is the clearest case. We leave it to future people, we leave it to people who live in deltas like, say, Bangladesh, because we are polluting, because we don't pay the true price. And of course, if an oil company sells oil, well, benzene, gas or whatever to us, they should charge us much more. And then part of that price should go to compensate those who are harmed from the, and that is just not happening in capitalism.
There's one particular target you have of bad groups, and it's evil corporates who, for example, Amazon, who you point the target at, and their profit-seeking gymnastics, for example, profit shifting to low-tax regimes. And I completely agree that I would love to see big tech, big corporates paying more tax in the jurisdictions they operate in. However, we have a concept of shareholder primacy in capitalism, and these organizations are legally bound and have fiduciary duties to maximize profits for their shareholders within the law. Yeah. And what they're doing is not illegal. So is the problem with those companies or with the legislation that they operate within?
There is definitely a problem with shareholder primacy, but I don't think shareholder primacy is a necessary feature of capitalism. If it is, then I'm against capitalism, but I don't think it is. I actually have colleagues who work on the ethics of the corporation and the political philosophy of corporation, and there's all sorts of very interesting developments with stewardship-oriented corporations and all sorts of corporations, and they work in a capitalist system, but they just do not take shareholder primacy. And I haven't looked into the history of this, but what I heard from colleagues is that shareholder primacy is also like relatively new. I mean, relatively over the history of course, capitalism is also, the question is when did capitalism really start? But I think shareholder primacy really is, might be one of the key causal problems we have. And I also don't see why we need it.
I tend
you
to agree.
should balance the different interests.
There's a big movement towards B Corp companies these days that recognize Kate Raworth's point about donut economics. And so let's move to the positive next steps. If we embrace these ideas that you've put forward in the book, how will that change society?
So inequalities in themselves already have the negative effects that I described. And there's also actually other people like, I mean, famously in the UK, the work by Pickett and Wilkinson on the effects that inequality have on social relations, on health, social determinants of health and so on. So I think having less inequality will benefit society for all the already existing reasons that we had. I also think it would free up a lot of money that we could use, first of all, to tackle climate crisis, which I really think is an existential crisis for humanity and other species on Earth. It would, and it would also help us to meet the needs of people whose needs are now not met. And it would create equality of opportunity. And of course, if you have equality of opportunity, it means that all those talented people that now cannot become the entrepreneurs who invent the new products or the geniuses or whatever, they will have an opportunity to not only have better lives, but also contribute more to society. So I think a society where inequality is restricted, you still should have flexibility, and I think we should leave that room. I think will be, overall, people will flourish.
And you also say that the rich will benefit too, Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so for the book, I interviewed a number of very wealthy people, and I tried to always ask them an open question because I wanted to just see what is the thing they want to bring to the conversation. And in the case of Abigail Disney, I was actually surprised that she started to talk, as I report in the chapter, she started to talk about what money does to your soul. She said, money corrupts your soul, and of course she was born in wealth, and she is among all these very wealthy people. And she described the psychological mechanisms of what being very wealthy does to your social relationships, to your character, and there is also scientific research that the children of the very wealthy actually are worse off than the children in the middle class because they tend to have spent less time with their parents, and they tend to become, you could call them, I think in the popular language you would say spoiled brats, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that doesn't really help because one day you will have to do it by yourself or not, but in any case, so...
You described this term affluenza that they suffer from, right?
Yeah,
the
that's
children
not my
of the
term.
rich.
It's a term. It's actually it was interestingly used, this term affluenza. So basically that that as a kid you are almost to pity because you were raised with too much money, and then you took a certain sense of entitlement and so on. There was a boy in the US who apparently was in this condition and then did some horrible things, and when he was in court, this was what the defense tried to put to his defense, that he couldn't be blamed because his parents corrupted his character. But I should say that there is some research that suggests that always wanting to have more money starts to work almost like an addiction. There's this tiny little book called The Psychology of Money that also describes that always moving the goalpost is like, that is like unsettling, but also makes you want to do things that you do actually not want to do. Also go into things like crime and deceit and so on. So I guess it could also be really liberating psychologically to just say as a person, and now it's enough. And that is what some of the wealth holders who've taken this decision also describe, the liberating effects.
It's the enough concept is very powerful. When you realize you have enough, it's quite liberating.
But neoliberalism doesn't have an enough concept.
Yeah, okay.
It has the sky is the limit.
Fair enough. So next steps, implementation. How do you turn these concepts into something practical, and who should be taking the first action here?
So I think when it comes to next steps or practical implementation, what's realistic in the short term really is what people who do not argue for caps but for more progressive taxation and for more redistribution, like Thomas Piketty and some others argue for. I think that the work that's been done by Gabriel Zuckman on fiscal paradises, how do you call them?
Tax havens.
Tax havens, that was the word I was looking for, thank you. And how they destabilize really, because we don't have free movement of people. Actually, we let people drown in the Mediterranean, but we do have pretty free movement of capital. And then, so there are some measures that I think we could really get a large coalition of people with different points of view agree on, but they would also be kind of preconditions of having more, really this idea of a limit to wealth. But I should say I'm also not, I have in the last chapter practical proposals, but since I'm writing this book, I mean, it's very interdisciplinary, but I write it as a philosopher. For me, I really want to get the societal conversation going. And if you look at how neoliberalism, I told you that it was implemented, I mean, we often say Reagan, Thatcher, they started to work on the ideas in the 1930s. They had conferences from 47 onwards. for years they were debating the reasons why they thought we should have economic liberty as the only value that's important. So that means that if we want to have a different economic system and also answer the question, what do we want from society? How do we want the social contract to be in a different way? I also think we shouldn't always immediately jump to implementation, but also dare to ask the foundational questions.
I love some of your practical ideas. I don't want to necessarily reveal them because I think they're a nice discovery in the book, but getting people together, mixing between classes, a deeper understanding of each other's needs, I thought was a really powerful idea. How do we get politicians to think about the long-term needs of society and not just what will get them re-elected in 4 years' time?
I don't know. I wish I had an answer to this. I mean, yeah, so I'm from the Netherlands, where at the last elections, the biggest party is now a right-wing party that says all climate policy literally through the shredder, and is very xenophobic and has no coherent program. So it's basically the pull towards the populist right that we've seen across Europe. It makes me really worried, because I do think that people who vote for those parties, many of them have legitimate complaints. Their complaints are really of being left behind. But we should have the conversation steered away from everything to do with tribalism and nationalism and the whole debate about so-called wokeness, and really talk about economics and explain. I mean, so the data about, so here's I looked up for this evening. I looked up the wealth distribution in the UK. So, for example, I mean, I just wonder, when I give talks in the Netherlands, I ask people about this, like, how do you think this looks like? So, for example, how much do you think in terms of wealth that the 10%, no, let's start at the bottom. The bottom 40% of the people in the UK, how much of the wealth do they have? The bottom 40%. So if it were completely equal, it means that 40% of the people would have 40% of the wealth. Well, they have 4.4%. 40% of people have 4.4%. At the other side, 10% of the people have 52% of the wealth, and then if you look at the 1%, they have 22.6%, and most likely that's underreported, because it's difficult to really get, I mean, the people who do this empirical work say it's most likely more. I mean, these figures, I mean, to have a debate about this, to really also describe how the people who work for Jeff Bezos, what kind of work life they have, these are the things we should be talking about.
Okay. I'm going to ask you for a brief answer to this one.
Sorry.
What can the audience here take away as an action after reading your book?
Yeah, so I think really to become politically active as a citizen, and I don't mean necessarily to join a party, although I do think that if you have a party that where you would see yourself fit, I do think we should. I mean, in the Netherlands we have like 10 parties, so everybody can find a party that they like. But I mean, embracing our role as a citizen, that I think is really the #1 step. And you might expect that I would say, give away your money. Yes, of course, if you happen to have a lot of money, I would recommend considering this. But I really think it is reclaiming society as ours and engaging in this debate. What kind of society do we want to be, want to have? That, I think, is a fundamental question. And if we don't as citizens take that space to debate this, others will do it for us.
Okay, so I told you I've gasped at several points in your book, but I found it full of challenging ideas, very, very thought-provoking. It changed my perspective. As I said, I'm on your side, and I've been lobbying for more progressive taxation for a few years now, and I realized that if you want to make really big change in society and affect inequality, you've got to set the bar much higher than perhaps we've been trying so far. So I'm sure you're all going to get a chance to read it now, and you will enjoy it. But thank you so much, Ingrid, and we're going to get to questions in a moment.
Yeah, thank you.
So we've got 20 minutes where we can have some questions. We have a couple of mics, I believe, and please wait for the mic to come to you because we're recording a podcast, so we'd like to capture your question. So when you ask me a question, please tell us your name. Please get to your question quickly or I'll hurry you up. Who would like to go first? Bernard. Who's got a mic for second row here?
Well, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking talk. My name is Bernhard, and I'm a tech entrepreneur. I worked very hard for 15 years, created hundreds of jobs, paid tens of millions of taxes, and then sold my company for several $100 million. So probably according to you, I was just lucky, but I do think, I was a bit of own effort in this as well. I wonder why you don't think that curbing the wealth that someone can create through an entrepreneurial journey at, let's call it, $10 million would not massively reduce the ambition of entrepreneurs. Because I personally think it's highly unfair that someone who has built, I don't know, Spotify or Tesla or Apple would get the same $10 million as someone who sold a restaurant chain that maybe hasn't impacted the world so much. Why don't you think this is the outcome? Because this feels a bit to me like creating Olympics where we abolish the medals and it doesn't really matter how fast you run, everyone will get exactly the same medal.
Yes, thanks very much for this question, because I think this is the question that I also get in my email box from people like you. So I think it's a very important question. This 10 million cap, the difference between the 1 million and the 10 million is precisely to have this, what we call the incentive, room for incentives. I would think that, so there are two elements in my response to you. One is, if it's really the case that there are many, many people who would not put in the work of inventing and working and so on, if the bar is so low, then we may have to have a higher political limit, because the limit is really meant to be creating that scope for innovation and so on. But the other element is also, I believe that this neoliberal culture that we have has also created among us this drive for well, and the whole argument, of course, about dessert, which I had to summarize very briefly, but also this drive for always wanting to have more. And there's so many people. Take the whole sciences. I can tell you that in academia, people work also 50, 60 hours a week. We have a fixed wage. I don't complain. I think we earn enough. But if we work 40 hours or 50 hours or 60 hours, it will be the same. Why? Because we're motivated by contributing to the public good. I don't understand why people who put a product in the market can also not, to some extent, be motivated by contributing to the public good. So for me, there's a question really about human psychology that I would put as a challenge to you.
Ingrid, I'm going to ask a follow-up to that. Andrew Carnegie was an industrialist who lived at the end of the 19th century, a steel industrialist in the US, Scottish-born. His view was that capitalism was okay and people should be free to earn whatever they can in their lifetimes, as long as that money flows back into society by the time they died. He didn't agree in inheritance. He said, the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. What about that idea, that you let capitalism create billionaires if necessary, but that money has to flow back in?
Yeah, so I do think I have a problem with the current capitalism that we have, because it allows a lot of rent seeking, which is where you really reap money from the system, not just the market, but because the government plays a part in it, without necessarily providing a product, because you can't internalize the negative externalities. All these reasons are like flaws of capitalism. So that's why I think we should have a mixed economy. But even then, I think the problem is that in theory, this could, and there are people who do this, and they are the, the laudable people. But a lot of philanthropists really use philanthropy either as a form to evade taxation, as a form to channel money to their children without paying gift or inheritance tax, or as for vanity projects. And if the fiscal system were fair, so if we had a fair tax system, they would not have so much money in the first place.
Okay.
So there's a big democratic question here about who gets to decide. And there's a very inspiring philanthropist, namely the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos. She wrote this piece on Medium where she said, all this money has been generated by society and it all goes back to society. And what she does is she gives it to social justice groups. They can't apply, she just spreads it out and tells them, do something good with it.
Okay, great. And next question? There's lady here in the red.
Really interesting talk, thank you. My name is Mahima. My question is about a point that you raised about the difference between the 10%, the top 10%, and the 1%, because from my anecdotal view of the top 10, or let's say the 9%, there's a lot of push for social change and justice and more equality and so on. But I sense that the 1% is typically where the biggest influence is in the political system, and also therefore where the bottleneck is. So I'm curious to hear more about whether you explored that, I think, a very crucial distinction in your book in any great detail.
Yeah, I don't, but it's a very good question. So I do think also, definitely if you look at the numbers, the 1% is really where the big money is. And if you think about the effect, say if you think about private jets, which are highly polluting, or if you think about yachts or buying media, we are looking at generally the 1%. So these are the potential harms to society. However, in the 10%, there are people who, they are called in the literature the wealth defense industry, accountants, lawyers, economists, and so forth, who basically are at the service of the 1% to make sure that they can accumulate their wealth with paying as little tax as possible, and in return they get a really nice salary. And so I think some people in the 10% are, and then there's also, of course, companies that have tax evasion strategies, profit shifting, and so on. So I don't think all the people in the 10% are necessarily off the hook when it concerns, these questions. But it is indeed a question like, should we focus on the 1% or also wider?
Thanks.
If I could quickly just add a point, like if you look at a place like London, which is overwhelmingly the biggest wealth centre in the UK, and also overwhelmingly votes Liberal or Labour in the UK, but then the pockets where the wealth is most concentrated will vote Conservative. I feel like there's more research to be done. I think that neo-patrimonial system exists, but I don't think all of the 10% belong to that neo-patrimonial system. And it'd be
no, actually, it is a critique on the Green Party in the Netherlands that they are that many of them are actually pretty affluent, exactly. And that they've lost touch with those who the real workers, as they say. And I think there's some truth to that critique. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the back of the room? It's more difficult to see you back there with the bright lights, but anybody? If there isn't, I'm going to ask. Sorry, one over here and then next down here.
Matt. So one is born with X amount of natural talents, and you use the word that means they are not deserving of whatever they are able to then go and do with that. But is that, just because one is born with something, why are they not able to then go and utilise that? And I'm talking about the natural lottery, not the social lottery. Why is that a bad thing, or why are they undeserving in and of itself? If it's a true lottery, how is that bad?
Oh, it is the lottery itself. It's just what it is, right? That's just life. So the lottery is, I think, everything that's purely nature. I think is, you can't say it's bad or good. It's just what it is. What I think is problematic is that we've in our culture we've come to take credit for what the economic system allows us to get or to do with those talents. And I do think, of course, talented people can decide to be lazy, or they can decide to be to do something good for society. And I think we should absolutely reward and praise people who do something good for society, for other people, and contribute to the economy and to society, so who put those talents to work. But I still think that the kind of, I mean, scholars would call this ideology in neoliberalism conflates those talents with what you can do with it. Whereas I think there are older traditions where people are actually just, they really say, I'm grateful that I have these talents and I'm trying to do something with it and put them to good use. So I think there is underlying my view, there is a view on human nature that is kind of different from the neoliberal view. So that is basic. And if you adopt that more view that also acknowledges that many people are vulnerable and have had bad luck in life that they can't really help, then you become more empathetic for those that are worse off. And I think that changes how you look at yourself, other people, and society. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Just before we go to the next question, we've got through this whole interview so far without mentioning the C word, communism.
I'm not a communist.
Okay.
In case
But
anybody wondered.
You do make the point in the book that you're not advocating communism, and communism suppresses natural abilities to strive for better, to compete, to advance. Is that right?
So what I found really unfortunate and not really helping democratic debate is that there are many people who say there are two options. What we have is capitalism and then the alternative is communism. And that's just framing it in a wrong way because there are many different options. It's really a scale of different socioeconomic systems that we can have. We have also varieties of capitalism. And I think what they often think is the only option then, if you don't have capitalism, is USSR-style communism. That was an oppressive system. It was a dictatorship, people were unfree, and so forth. So I just don't, I mean, yeah.
Okay, thanks. We're going to go to a question over here.
Thank you. Great talk, great ideas. Thank you very much. Great question, Bernard. Very provocative starting question. I want to ask you something which is it's a little bit off page for your book, but it's a question that I'm interested in, and I wonder if you paid, I'm sure you've paid some attention to it. It is related to what you're saying, because there is, in the way that you're thinking, there is something about it which will raise the hackles of people, which is based on the idea of, it's my money, you want to take away my money. And, well, I don't have the money, but I might have it one day, so don't take away my right to be a multi-millionaire. So the personalization of it is slightly problematic. And I'm thinking of sort of systemic change. So one of the big systemic change that people are thinking about is the problem of interest on money. And of course, more and more things have to be produced, and the planet has to be looted in order to pay the interest on the money that's been borrowed to fund the production in the first place. So interest is a huge driver behind inequality and climate change and so on. And I wonder if you thought about the question of interest.
Thanks for that question. Unfortunately, the answer is no. I haven't thought about interest. I do, in the last chapter, I basically say, okay, I do believe we should have a different socioeconomic system. I say socioeconomic because I think it's not just the economy, but also everything that so far we've put under the welfare state. I call that then the socio. These things interact. I mean, if you have a certain welfare state, it also allows more in the economy and vice versa. And all the two systems together actually determine or influence our quality of life and our freedoms in society and our lives. And there, I mean, to have a society without interest is one possibility. I think I list a number of proposals. I think some are more utopian than others. My sense, but I may be wrong, is that this is a pretty utopian idea to abolish interest. But it is definitely one that we should look into. And I should also say, I don't want to it's true. When you started to raise your question, you say it shouldn't be about people, but people and the system. The only agents who can change the system are people. So we have to also talk about ourselves, and also. But for example, I don't like the phrasing. The phrasing, for example, there shouldn't be any billionaires. It's not about the people. It's about what the concentration of wealth can do, and it's indeed about what the system allows. And a lot in the book is really about the structures that cause this. And that's also why I don't know whether you've heard of these so-called effective altruists, who think those who have money should give it away in a manner that creates the most good. I think they lack really system analysis.
Okay, let's move to a question down here in the second row.
Sorry, I'm shuddering for the effect of altruism. Hi, I'm Hebu. Thank you so much for your talk. I've been looking forward to this all month. I have a question about metrics, what we measure, and also virtue signaling. In my career building things that hopefully could serve people, what I found is that if you pick one metric, and if you optimize for that, because people will optimize for a number or a metric that they can count, they can see, they can compare, then you often end up with terrible results and building the wrong thing or unforeseen consequences. And particularly, thinking about the field of machine learning, this is something that the ethics contribution has really thought about a lot. Like, if you're choosing the wrong objective function, you're going to have unintended consequences. So I'm curious, we have this metric of money. It's a very simple one. We can virtue signal a lot or unvirtue signal a lot. Have you come across other metrics that people have used, maybe about citizenship, about other attributes that could be good check metrics or ways of not worshipping at the altar of this one metric?
That's a great question. So we should have a metric of the meaning of life. There's all these philosophical books about the meaning of life. Yeah, that's going to be impossible. But we have it at the aggregate. So there is this movement of criticizing GDP per capita, which is in the end, economic production then turned into a monetary number. And that movement really seems to be taking off now, finally, after all these decades of discussion. But it is again at the aggregate, it's at the country level. I don't know any discussions about really at the product or the individual level, and nothing comes to mind, but I think it would be great to have that. Yeah, you could kind of ask yourself, how many people in my life was I able to help? But then, of course, the question that you raised comes back, because if you can say, I made this product that really helped a lot of people, it could be, that could be. But I think it's both so there's both what you do for good, and there's also then what doing that gives you. And lots of people do loads of stuff for nothing.
Yeah, when I was starting my business, my wife gave up her career to raise our 3 children, and that enabled me to focus on the business. It was her choice, and if she wanted to go back to work. But she always said that her contribution wasn't recognized in GDP. But if she had gone to work for our neighbor's children and her neighbor had come to work for us, that would be in GDP. And it doesn't make any sense. If you care for humans and provide valuable services, that doesn't count for GDP in some cases.
And some of these discussions about alternative economic systems, such as the donut, but also the well-being economy. There's also a well-being economy alliance of governments trying to implement this. They really start from quality of life as a central thing. But of course, quality of life is multidimensional, so you don't have the power of one number. That's a tragedy.
So I think we're out of time now. I'm going to ask you one more question. Are you going to release books about libertarianism for calories, property, other things?
No, I think I now, just like you said, you're a recovering entrepreneur. I think I am a recovering writer. I need to recover from writing this book. But I think the idea of limits, we have it, of course, in society in many areas. And I think limits can be liberating, really.
Okay, yeah. That's the phrase for the event. Thank you so much, Ingrid.
Thank you.